Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. You signed up to attend What Happened to My Plant Pathology 101, and we have Dr. Pat Williams teaching this for us today, and I'm really delighted that he was willing to do this. For a lot of you who man the plant desk or plant clinic, this is kind of one of those things that comes up a lot. People usually reach out when they're having a problem, and I know I always enjoyed being able to ask Pat questions. So Pat, whenever you're ready, take it away.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I see some familiar faces, and of course, there's going to be some unfamiliar faces all the way across the way. For those who are in Sarasota, you know, I've already been up here a year and 3 days, and I used to have a small cubicle in the office there. So for all the Sarasota folks, I want you to look at my new office here. A little bit bigger than my cubicle. So people always thought I left because I got tired of Wilma picking on me, but it was really to get the big office. At any point in time, it's very hard when you're doing something like this because it does feel a little bit impersonal. I see 68 people joining us today, and I get to see, like, you know, 3 or 4 of you. If you do have questions, just unmute yourself and please ask your question. You know, there is a chat button, which, depending on where you are, is located probably at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, then Wilma and Mindy will be monitoring the chat. They can let me know that you've asked a question, but otherwise it's okay just to unmute and ask. So here we go. Get a drink beforehand. Plant pathology. I have to preface today because whenever we talk about plant pathology, then everything you're going to see for the next 20 weeks everywhere is a plant pathogen. And that's really just not the case. As we kind of look at things, we'll define a few things and then talk about why that's not so. We're going to talk about plant pathologies just in general. Abiotic and biotic factors. Abiotic are not alive. Biotic are alive. So in there can be everything from insects and diseases that are there. We're going to talk about the 3 major pathogens: fungi, bacteria, and viruses, difference between signs and symptoms. If you're on the Master Gardener side of this presentation today, knowing the difference. One, you've got causal agents there. The other one, you don't. We're going to review for the Master Gardener disease triangle, and for everybody else, just how you help with diseases in your yard, and then a little bit of just management strategies. All right, intro. So going back, this is just the state's Master Gardener presentation with a few edits by me. Plant pathology, the study of suffering of the disease or diseases of the plant, which means at some point in time, the plant isn't healthy and it's struggling, it's not growing right, or it might even be on the way of dying. We have 2 major categories that we put these dysfunctions into. And the first is abiotic factor. And this is usually environmental or cultural practices that are causing some type of plant dysfunction. But I usually like to tell people when we're doing this, and I'm doing 2 plant or Master Gardener classes right now, I say about 92% of the problems out there in the world are not caused by biotic factors, which means environmental or cultural. If you're working a plant clinic, then 9 out of 10 problems coming in probably started out environmental or cultural. Why do I say started out that way? Because, well, if I'm overwatering, can I eventually get a fungal disease? Yes, but the cause of it was not the fungus getting started. It was that somebody was overwatering. Or, you know, at times we sit there and say, well, how does the environment cause problems? If you're, excuse me, in your part of Florida and you get down to 26, temperature can cause an awful lot of damage in Sarasota County. Just for the sake of knowing where everybody is, and then Wilma can let me know, but if you will find chat, which by the way should be in the middle of your lower screen, and if you click on chat and type in where you're from today. So if you're doing from There's Northport, Gainesville, Sarasota. I've got Pat and Diane's coming from, I've got somebody Pinellas, Venice, St. Petersburg, Venice, Sarasota, Brevard, Inglewood.
They're fast. I think they're
Oviedo, Seminole County, Jacksonville,
Louisiana,
Canopy. I know that's along the coast. We've got the
North Wales,
Kearneys coming in, Canada.
Bosnia,
All right. So we're kind of everywhere around.
El Paso.
And it really doesn't mean whether you're, you know, in another country or another state. All these things will kind of come in that same point. So lots of different folks around. Thank you for that. Bosnia and Herzegovina. Oh, wow. We're global today.
You got somebody from Dublin too.
If you're coming from a foreign country today, and I'm the only speaker from the United States, then by default, I'm the best speaker that you've heard today from the United States. But anyway, so here we go. Remember, all the way through this, 9 out of 10 problems generally are not going to be from something that's alive, such as an insect or a pathogen. We put our abiotic factors into injury and or disorders. And then we have our biotic factors. And we'll talk more about those. All right, here's some more examples of injury, physical harm done by something that's not alive. Lightning strikes. In Florida, we're like the lightning strike capital of the United States. Another thing, you know, we kid about it, but we call them mower blights, string trimmer or weed eater blights and things like that. Equipment. Animals can cause lots of problems. Chemicals, you know, down, depending on HOAs in Sarasota County, they have homeowners associations for you folks who are not familiar with HOA term, and they have basically rules, or what they call covenances, and they have to keep your tile roofs clean, and some people use chlorine and bleach, and that can cause damage dripping down. Over fertilizing, and even compaction, which is the pressing of all the airspace out. But remember, none of these is alive, with the exception of the animals, I guess, but they're doing other things like tinkling on the plants or eating them. So here we have 2 examples of that injury. On the left, we have probably what started out to be lawnmower damage and then followed up by some string line trimmer. As far as landscape design goes, this is a good reason never to put trees in lawns because something's going to be hit. The picture on the right, this is a golf course being hit by lightning. One day it doesn't look like this, the next day it does, and people will try to do all sorts of things. How does the fungus, you know, grow in a line like that? But it's not. My word of advice is don't look at pathogens first, because ultimately, even when we have pathogens, it's because we did something wrong in that abiotic factor because of environment and or cultural. Here on the left, we have somebody that sprayed weed killer. I will always tell people, if somebody's spraying something and you're 3 blocks away and you can smell it, that means you've got volatilization, you've got drift, and you're inhaling chemicals. So if you can inhale it, you know, 3 or 4 houses away, imagine that settling down on your neighbor's yard, and or somebody just filled something and spilled it. Fireworks, you know, these spots that just appear overnight. If you happen to come back from vacation and you saw this and you know that fungal diseases in your lawn start off and then they turn darker in the middle and they have a halo around them, everybody might think that this is a fungal disease, but this is just firework damage. Some examples of disorders. These are things environmentally. You know, I always like to say with temperature, it's too cold, too hot, or just right. So we can get both of these in Florida. I'm in the Florida Panhandle. In Wakulla County, the big city or big incorporated area of Crawfordville. And we do get frost here. That's why Wilma doesn't come to visit me. In light, you can have too shady, too sunny, or just right. I know people that still take their houseplants outside to get sun during the day, and they go from, you know, like 5, 10, 15 foot candles up to 10,000, and they sunburn their plants. Water. You know, overwatering, still the worst thing we can do for plants. Over fertilizing is right up there next to that. We happen to be in Florida where we get a lot of tidal surge from big storms, and flooding and saltwater intrusion is always a big thing up here. Nutrients. People don't understand nutrients, and I'll just do my real quick with this is fertilizer is not medicine. It is a stressor. And if the plant is not in a situation to use those nutrients that you're putting in, then that can cause damage. Up here, we see more damage because a lot of the turf grasses that we have up here, Bahia grass and centipede grass, don't like a lot of nitrogen. I've had a couple instances in the last month alone where people have put on 29% nitrogen. And I had a call last week, somebody put on this product they bought at a box store, and it was a 3503. And she had centipede grass that doesn't like really more than about 10 to 15% nitrogen, and she's killing her whole lawn. We don't have a lot of air pollution, but other parts of the country, I know I grew up in Southern California, and those can be. But once again, none of these, 9 out of 10 times, these first couple slides are the reason that you're having problems. Here's some cold damage. If you're in Florida and you have palms and things like that, you know, sometimes that orangish appearance is a potassium deficiency. But cold damage usually happens right overnight. If you have an incident, freeze, looks like a watermark inside the leaf, it just exploded, all the cells, walls were ruptured in the freeze. But this is cold damage, immediately going down overnight. Don't prune off all that stuff, by the way, because that's insulation. Because if it happens a few nights in a row, especially if you live in a warm area, a lot of people want to go prune all that off. But then the next time it's cold, it has brand new tissue. And if you happen to prune, that can stimulate new growth as well. That will be even harder hit by more cold. This is the overwatering and the underwatering. Oedema are kind of like water blisters that boil up on leaves. Here we've got a succulent, looks like maybe a calancho or a kalanchoe leaf. A lot of these plants like to be dry. The drought on the other side, when the leaf tissue dries out so much, we have an accumulation of salts in the tissue and it just kind of burns it. That's why we get that kind of brownish necrotic look. All this is caused by watering, which is something that we can control to some extent, especially if we have irrigations. If we happen to live in Florida and the rainy season is just starting, then we really can't, but we can turn off our irrigation systems, so we're not doing both.
Hey, Dr. Pat, can you go
Yes.
back one slide, please? So, are you going to get into the part where you say how we know if it's the too much or too little water? Because sometimes people aren't very forthcoming with what their practices are. Like, is there a way to tell? Like, do you put it under a microscope? You compare it to other images? How do you know?
When we start talking about pathogens, there's some more telltale signs of things. They have patterns that they come in. And, part of it is asking 20 questions, Mindy. Wilma goes out and she sees edema and she asks them if they're overwatering. The first thing they're going to say, Wilma, is what? Oh, no, I never overwater. And, their sprinkler system's going on 6 times a week, but it's not supposed to be hitting the beds. Or if this is a, calancho in a pot with no drainage, well, there's your answer. It's part of that, investigation. Usually you find that the problem, but good question, Mindy, because what I don't want people to do is jump to conclusion. Can either of these, also be caused by diseases? Possible, but the pattern, especially for the drought, is not. The oedema is, but you would look under the microscope for the cell ruptures coming up and making the bumps. And when we have things like diseases, they usually decompose tissues, so we have sunken tissues versus ruptures coming out. Good question, and anybody can just stop anytime and ask a question. We may not finish in an hour and a half, but what are they going to do? Not ask me to do this anymore? I don't know. Here we have a couple questions from Too Little. And, for the master gardeners on here, this picture on the right can be middle of winter. So you always have to know what time of year it is before you start making your diagnoses. And the spot on the left in the middle, the irrigation can be just put in wrong. Or I have extra sandy soil there and it's leaching really fast. There can be other reasons why there's not enough water being held in the soil. They put in, a compost when they were mending the backyard and they forgot that spot there. That could be another reason, not necessarily a break in the irrigation system. Another type of disorder is nutrient deficiencies. In palms, we have 4 big nutrient deficiencies: potassium, magnesium, boron, and manganese. So here we have manganese deficiencies. It looks an awful lot like cold damage on the one on the right, on the sago palm, which isn't a palm. But also, you know, if this is happening in the middle of summer, then we know it's not cold damage. Here we have a calcium deficiency, otherwise known as blossom end rot on tomatoes. Other things can kind of cause some of these things, but here again, you know, depending on how fast this is going out, you're going to show signs of other diseases, other parts of the plant behind just this. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we progress, but this is part of that biotic disease triangle, and you have to have all 3 of these in order to have something. And we will talk about this a little bit more. Our whole management strategy is to break one of these sides so that we don't have this. Keeping pathogens out is almost impossible because fungal spores float on the wind. Having a susceptible host, most of you aren't going to remove every plant. And what we can really do is start looking at what we do with the environment and how our cultural practices. So here is something that really comes back to 2 of the 3 sides of this disease triangle are abiotic factors. And if we learn to control those, then we're going to be better at controlling our pathogens. All right. Here are some of our big diseases that we've had worldwide in the past. Of course, the Irish potato blight. Pierce's disease came about probably in the 90s, almost single-handedly wiped out the Texas grape industry. Dutch elm disease in the East Coast here, and also the American chestnut blight. Lethal yellowing and lethal bronzing, and also citrus greening. We don't tend to see a lot of lethal yellowing as much anymore, but lethal bronzing. If you're in Florida and you drive 75 between Gainesville and Tampa, you see a lot of the new plantings that they're putting in are getting lethal bronzing on these palms. And all these palm diseases are fatal. And then we even have some banana diseases going on down in South America that are changing all these things. If you're elsewhere outside of Florida, citrus greening, I like to tell people was very horrible. A lot of people lost their livelihoods, but one of the silver linings to all of that is Florida agriculture diversified. We are now famous for blueberries. We are now famous for strawberries. We are famous for coleus and other things like that that are coming out that if we would have had no problems with citrus, I don't know if these other monies would have been spent to develop all these other things. All right, getting to why you all tuned in today, other than to see Wilma pick on you, which she hasn't even really yet. For those that know Wilma and I, you know we miss each other. All right. Biotic factor, we have something that is alive. It may be only the size of a single cell, but it is alive and it functions. And with that, it also makes more of itself. I was going to say breed, but in the case of bacteria, it just cleaves itself and makes 2. It's caused by interaction between the plant and the pathogen. And what we see, identifiable signs and symptoms, signs are part of the organism. So if I have powdery mildew, that powdery mildew on the top surface is reproductive structures of the fungal strains that are growing inside the leaf tissue, and that is a sign. If I have something that's turning kind of yellowish or brownish, those are symptoms. And here we go. Where can we get a plant disease? Anywhere from the tips of the roots to the very tips of the plant. We can get them in flowers, we can get them in fruit. There is no part of the plant that is not susceptible to a disease. Why is a disease a problem? It's a disruption of normal plant function. Can a plant have a disease and keep on living? Yes. We have a lot of crepe myrtles, depending on where you've been in life, that have lived for 20, 30 years with, powdery mildew. It's a fungal disease that lives in the plant, but the plant is healthy enough that it doesn't kill it. However, if we have, say, a squash plant that gets downy mildew, well, it's not going to even complete its life cycle. With that, it can shorten it. And things, when we get viral infections, those are fatal, and we don't have any chemicals to treat viruses with, so there's no sense in being able to save that. Plus, we also know that in diseases, especially with fungal and bacterial diseases, we have fungicides and bactericides, so they can be fixed. All right, a pathogen is the causal agent. That means the thing that's disrupting that. Our three big pathogens are fungal, bacteria, and we now hook phytoplasms onto this because phytoplasms are the pathogens that's causing lethal yellowing and lethal bronzing for palms, especially in the state of Florida. And then we have viruses. And they're all kind of distinct. All right, let's start off with the most common. Now, we started off by saying 9 out of 10 times it's not, when we see symptoms like that, it's not a disease. Now, when we come into that last 10%, what we're saying that almost 85% or 8.5 times out of 10 that we have a disease, it's going to be fungal. Why is that? Anybody can answer. Look at that, out of those 89 people, Wilma, everybody's just throwing, they're putting answers into chat, aren't they? They're not unmuting. I know, I know. All right, the reason is because they float on the air. If you were outside today, and unless it was perfectly still, you have fungal spores on your clothing. You have fungal spores in your hair, everywhere else. And as they fly through the air, they land on a plant, then they need conditions. We talked about that with the disease triangle. Just because they landed on your plant, the plant may not be a host-specific plant to that fungal disease, meaning that the fungus can't do that. And with that, they just sit there until we have like freestanding water. Most of the fungi we have reproduce by spores. And besides wind, everything else can spread them. Splashing water. So if I'm watering my garden and I have a fungal infection on one plant and I splash it, I can splash those fungal spores to the next. Makes it really important when we're watering outside of raining to water the soil and not the plants. Do you know that if I'm pruning in between plants, my pruning device can spread fungal disease? It's very important if you're pruning and you suspect any type of a fungal disease to make sure you prune back. Here we have black spot on a rose, and that all those leaflets that you see are one leaf. And I would make sure that depending on the size of the rose that I would prune back. I just wouldn't prune off the leaf. And then after I pruned it, I would certainly disinfect my tools before I made any other prunes on that same rose plant and or especially another rose. They can enter through natural openings. So we don't have to have that. It said tools and human activities. Your dog can brush by infected plants out in the pasture and then come through your garden and spread fungal spores onto your plants.
We have somebody with a question.
All righty. So there's a question. Go ahead, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I have about 80 tomato plants, and we're dealing with a couple of problems here. We've got something that's boring into the tomatoes. We've got tomatoes as big as softballs, practically, and with 80 plants, and of course they're all trellised. And we've got another problem called tobacco mosaic, which is attacking our plants, and we've quarantined over 11 plants and pulled them away from the regular plants. But we've got something that's boring holes into the top of the tomato, and right around the very top also we're having where it's splitting, and it appears, and of course right now we're getting an overabundance of water from all the rain we're having, and so we've got an in-ground micro sprinkler that's set up for the entire garden, and we're growing lots of stuff, not just tomatoes, but quite a lot of problems developing suddenly.
Well, I mean, hopefully you don't lose everything. But, as far as the tobacco mosaic virus, Yes, that is a virus, and you need to dispose of all plant tissue, any leaf droppage or anything like that. Make sure you take those away, and then just really be on the look for those, because anything that was to either side of those technically depend on how you came in and did those things. And a lot of the viral diseases are spread by insect vectors. In tomatoes, you've got whitefly, you've got leaf hoppers, anything like that can really spread the virus between plants. As far as what's boring in the top, we're going to probably say that's not a pathogenic, but could be anywhere from birds. If it's a peck hole in there, and they're kind of doing that. Generally, squirrels will remove the tomato before they start eating out of that, where they won't chew on the top all the time. But I would dare suspect, Wilma, what do you think? Birds?
It was birds or possibly some kind of caterpillar that you only see at night, but that's not as likely. It's more likely to be birds, and the splitting is usually caused by a calcium deficiency, or all of a sudden because of all the rain.
Rain, too much moisture, growing too
We
fast.
do have the green hornworm.
Yeah.
Right. But they tend to eat the foliage before.
Right.
They don't generally eat on that. All right. I don't know if I really answered that, but I mean, you
Okay.
kind of, but yeah, just keep an eye out. All right. One of the things that you have to know about when we talk about plant pathogens and we say things like fungal, we have what we call pathogenic organisms and non-pathogenic. So kind of to define both of those. The rose black spot is a pathogenic. It comes into the rose with the intent to do harm. It landed on there, it entered through a natural opening such as stomates on the back of the leaves or the top of the leaves, and it's going to do damage. Sometimes we have non-pathogenic, and I always say if you're walking through the forest and you see mushrooms growing on a tree that's been down for a while, those mushrooms that fungal organism did not kill the tree, but they're certainly taking advantage of a free lunch. That's the big difference. Now, with that said, a non-pathogenic can enter a plant through wound, a break, from storm damage, or even you pruning. It's not likely to attack the plant without those openings, so be careful when you're pruning depending on the time of year. General rule of thumb for shrubs and things like that, trees, are the end of winter. Fungal spores. What do we need? We talked about that disease triangle. Well, if the fungal spore is there, what they need more than anything is moisture. If I'm watering like this, and the gentleman said we've got the micro sprayers and I'm leaving drops of water, then all it takes is that be a shady spot, or to do this later in the afternoon, and that drop of water to stay there the whole time, and I can get that fungal spore to germinate and start to grow. The other thing that we find a lot of times in Florida, we get those real quick afternoon showers, and then our humidity goes from 110% up to 120. And for all those that aren't in Florida, that don't realize our humidity, that was a joke, but pretty darn close. This is what we're really looking at in kind of a simple drawing. Our fungal spore lands on the top of the leaf or the bottom of the leaf, and there are openings, stomates. This is how the leaf takes in carbon dioxide, which is needed for photosynthesis, and it's a natural opening. If I have a freestanding drop of water over that microscopic fungal spore, I will start to grow, I will find the opening, and now I'm inside. And once I'm inside, I'm protected. And then I get to grow and grow and grow. Once inside, I start producing what we call hyphae or mycelia in plural. And I'm in a vegetative state at that point. And I can stay in there, I can overwinter in there. As long as I have a food source, I don't feel compelled to reproduce. And at some point in time, I will reproduce, and I will send up a fruiting body, not always on the top of the leaf. On some of our things like Downy Mildew, I can produce fruiting bodies off the bottom side of the leaf. And at that point in time, I've got a little bitty staff, and my spore sits on top, and all it takes is wind or water, anything to break that off. And then once again, I'm mobile and I can land other places. Bacteria. Bacteria are a little bit smaller, And one of the things that's kind of hard, I'm going to back up real quick just to tell you something back here. When we start looking at fungal diseases and bacterial diseases, this isn't very indicative of what we have, because if the pathogen is killing really quick, then I don't have discoloration circles or halos around. When we get our bacterial infection here, I just wanted to kind of point out that the bacterial infection enters an opening. This is a stomate, and all it takes is one bacterium, and they will replicate themselves through asexual means. They can cleave and reproduce. And as they start feeding, they are microscopic. You can't see a stomate, so you certainly can't see a bacterium. And because of that, even though they're mobile in water or plant fluids, they don't travel very far before they replicate again. And what that means when we start seeing things is that we generally have discoloration. Wilma, can you see my arrow moving in the middle of the screen? So when I point out things, so right here, I have a new infection. I'm starting to kill things, and then it's dead in the middle. It's now brown. And what's happening is my bacterium, those little microscopic things, are breeding and moving outward. I tend to get circular depending on what it's in. In some of the palms, the veins are really tough in between, so I go along in linear fashions. You do have to be careful. And one of the things that I talk about, Wilma and I have seen damage like this from wind, where the thorns on the citrus, the fruit was moving back and forth, and it was causing punctures. And of course, anytime I get a puncture, that may allow other diseases to come in, but the initial puncture, and I will have a hole versus a sunken spot. One of the things we know that's different between bacteria and fungal diseases is bacteria really build up populations, and they're voracious eaters. They will decompose cell walls, which means generally we have sunken spots on our stems and our leaves. And our fungal diseases, we're usually at the same level. We just get discoloration because they're going in around. You saw how the hyphae or the mycelia, they grow in between and around. They will take the path of least resistance as they're going through plant tissue. Bacteria just consume everything in their way. And with that, cell walls and things that support the outside, they will go ahead and cause what we call lesions and or cankers. The phytoplasm at the bottom here does require an insect. So we know that much about the lethal bronzing and the lethal yellowing. We're narrowing down on the leaf hoppers that we assume are doing all this, but how do you keep a leaf hopper out of the bottom or the top of your 30-foot tall palm? You can't. If I'm going too fast, please just put in the chat to slow down. Fungi versus bacteria, remember, 85% of the diseases, at least in Florida, are fungal. Bacteria diseases can be spread by pruning as well. That's why we're losing so many palms, because of the pruning companies, and they tend to be a little bit more difficult. One of the things about both of these treatments, you have to know what type of bacteria and fungicide that you're putting out. One does not fit everything. It's just like insecticides or herbicides. If you don't know what you're trying to treat, you need to have that diagnosed. And we know that high temperatures and humidity favor both of these. Is it possible to get a bacterial infection and a fungal infection on the same plant? Of course, especially after storms, the summer storms with hurricanes and or tornadic events.
Pat, there's a question. The phytoplasm or phytoplasma, was it palms that are showing a problem by that element?
Yes. We put phytoplasms in with the bacterium because they're more closely related. But what happens with things like the phytoplasms and a lot of the palm diseases, they will come in under softer tissue at the top, and they work their way down the vascular systems and really start kind of killing from the bottom up.
And another person does, I think they mean bleach, kill fungi and bacteria on tools.
Well, I don't know. I don't see a lot of fungi and bacteria growing on sand at the beach, so maybe they did mean beach. Oh, Peggy said bleach.
So,
Yes.
so in other words, do you have a recommendation or a suggestion or what you like to use for disinfectant?
I was getting there, Mindy. I was getting there. My goodness. Wilma's being nice. Oh, you guys must have said, let's play good cop, bad cop to throw Pat off.
We've
So
been
Wilma's
plotting
good
for a
cop
while.
today and Mindy's bad cop.
Yeah, we've been working on it.
Okay, it's going flawless, so thank you. All right, Peggy, bleach is a good sanitation mechanism, but diluted. So 1 part bleach, 1 tablespoon bleach to 9 tablespoons water. You don't want to use straight bleach. Then after you're done, and remember, if you're going to do this, I just get a small container and I dip my pruners after every cut, because otherwise, if I'm not, I can be spreading. And then at the end, with any of these things, you have to then make sure you're cleaning your tools very well and then re-lubricating. All right. And you can also use things like isopropyl alcohol that will evaporate real fast. The higher percentages are better, like 90. You can spray that on the blades, but there again, wash things good outside. All right, Diane wrote, where did you say they maneuver to kill the phytoplasms? Outside, inside. The phytoplasm is injected into the plant via a insect vector, generally something with the piercing, sucking mouth part. Once the phytoplasm is in, there is no cure. We do have some things where we can do some preventative treatments, but really after the disease is in the palm, they are fatal. And they take a very long time. If you've heard of things like Ganoderma, which is a fungal disease in palms, and or lethal bronzing and stuff, the plant could have had those in the plant for 3 years before they start showing outward symptoms of discoloration and or conchs, which would then be a sign. If I answer your question and I don't answer it completely, just put a comment back in there and we'll keep going. All right, so back to the slide. On the far left, you have a leaf hopper. And I say those things can be as little as 1/8 of an inch up to maybe closer to 3/16, maybe even 1/4. We've got some big leaf hoppers on the blanket flower right outside the door here. The stoma are just the openings. There's your spore fruiting body on a stem. And here's the thing that people don't understand, that you can't wash fungal spores off. I've seen people take high pressured water and try to wash the powdery mildew off their crepe myrtle. And all that does is spread the spores to the rest of the plant so that infects it quicker and can lead to its demise. Remember, things like the bacteria, it's on the inside and nothing's going to wash away. You would have to use a chemical measure on both of those to kill it on the inside. All right, viruses. By far the smallest, and it has to reproduce in a living host. So as far as we know, pruning tools and stuff like that don't really spread the viruses. Unfortunately, at this point in time, we don't have viricides, so we can't do that. Now, you know, it lists people in there because tobacco mosaic virus has been known to spread through tobacco smoke. And with that, because it's airborne at that point in time, if it was in the cigarette, then, and also if you're handling it, it's on your hands and you're sweaty and you've got oils, then that's what they say it can do that. Generally, when we have a virus, we have a discoloration and it kind of forms patterns. I can't really blow up too much, but you'll notice the ones on the lower right, we're starting to get intervenal chlorosis. And it's when we start looking at things like viruses versus nutrient deficiencies, it kind of starts out in certain spots and then moves through. Deficiencies are generally either top or bottom of the plants. We've mentioned this before, that the disease was a disruption, and we also mentioned looking for signs and symptoms. So we'll run through a few signs and symptoms just to get everybody kind of on the same page. And I'm Mindy, make sure I'm watching time here. We're about halfway done, aren't we?
I'm trying to remember how long I gave it.
Didn't you give me like 3.5 hours? I thought you gave me 3.5 hours. We've got folks over in Europe that's already like, 9 o'clock saying, I'm not staying up till midnight. All right. What is a sign? A sign is when we actually have something that we can pull apart and look at. Spores. We talk about powdery mildew and downy mildew. Those are the fungal spores reproducing on the outside. That is part of it. So when we look at that, we can identify it by seeing the organism. A symptom, on the other hand, is an outward expression of the causal agent. This is when we have discoloration, we have spots, we have patches, we have things dying back, but we don't see any sign of the causal agent that's doing the damage. One of the things on this bottom note, leaf spot, this is really hard. And with that, unless we send that off to a lab to be diagnosed, we can't always be 100% sure. Jennifer has a question. Should I pull out all of the mushrooms that show up in my pots after a rain? So the question is yes, unless they're an edible mushroom and you're a mushroom farmer, then yeah, let them grow. Mindy, you're not supposed to laugh. It just encourages me to be more obnoxious that way. But what's happening with that is you've got mycelia growing in your potting mix. And if you look at why, they're probably decomposing the organic matter that makes up your potting mix. And they're not necessarily feeding on your plant. And that's why even in lawns and stuff after rains, they kind of pop up. What you want to do is you want to remove those before the bottoms open up and the spores start raining out of the gills, I believe they're called. So yes, you can just pop those off. And if you have a compost pile, if it gets hot enough, you can just put those in there. All right, Cy wrote, spray bleach and water 1 to 9 on the sick plants and also on tools. All right, we tend not to spray bleach on plants just because depending on how you mix it and things like that. And anytime you start spraying plants, we don't know, we have what we call phytotoxicities or any type of thing like that. And we don't recommend doing that because at some point in time, somebody can say, well, I sprayed bleach on my plant, and they'll say, well, I sprayed bleach on my plant, and they all died. So really be careful with that. I know in some circumstances when we're doing mass propagation at large, nurseries and things like that, they will dip all of their cuttings in a disinfectant, but they are making sure that it's there, and they're using things that don't have residues. A lot of the bleaches that we have over the counter, they leave kind of a residue on things, so I would be very careful. And remember, bleach is a disinfectant. It's not going to kill the causal organism. So even if you spray bleach on the outside of powdery mildew, you're not going to kill what's on the inside. And for that to really happen, the bleach would have to penetrate inside the plant, and then that can do damage to the cells.
If they're using a bleach solution, if they've pre-mixed it, is there a shelf life for how long they can keep it? Like, do they need to remix, or how does that work?
Bleach, once it's put in water, degrades pretty fast. Therefore, if I mixed up a spray bottle for my tools today, I might use it for 1 or 2 or 3 days at the most, providing I didn't store it in the middle of the sun and stuff like that. But really, having bleach water and using it once a month, I would not say the bleach at that point is being very effective. All right, so Jennifer posted, I heard peppermint oil mixed with water is good. I kind of laugh a little bit because in extension, we stay away from homemade remedies. And the reason we do that is not all peppermint oil is the same, and not everybody mixes it the same. And ultimately, a lot of these things are surface because oils are, by necessity, they stick. They don't run so much. Things like neem oil. Whenever we start getting into horticultural oils, Annie put in. There are temperature restrictions on things like neem oils and the natural oils. Some of the oils, this is made from neem, the tree, but some of the other petroleum-based, they do have, restrictions on temperature. All right, another one I've been doing preventative fungicide programs and watering the rose bushes regularly, but most of them do have yellowing leaves starting with brownish spots, which I'm not able to control. Would you please advise? All right. One of the things, anything that will say, fungi do build up resistance. I don't know where you're at, Dr. Igor, so I'll just kind of show you something. One of the things that I always recommend to people is we have a couple different things. And if you have a smartphone, there is an app called FRAC. Let me put it in here. I'll put it in the chat. It's called FRAC, and that is the fungicide resistance thing. And what it is, I'll show my screen here. I don't know. I've got everything, so I'll just kind of show this here. And what that is when you download this, you take the active ingredient of the fungicide that you've been using. And what it will do is it will give you a mode of action, how that fungicide is disrupting. When it comes to fungicides, we have fungicides that will treat very early. And then we have fungicides that can actually kill the fungus, the fungal spores on the outside, so they're not viable and they can spread. So you really have to know how your fungicide is working. If you've been using the same preventative fungicide this whole time, then what you're using is, out of the millions of spores that can be landing there, all it takes is one of those to be resistant to that chemical. What we recommend is that you go ahead and have at least a couple different fungicides and rotate those. Yellowing leaves, depending on the spots and everything like that. And it's very hard, and I can't go on too long because we'll never get through, but overwatering can, then lead to other stressors. So some of the yellowing could be nutrient deficiencies and/or if you do check both of those, I can't tell you offhand, but mancozeb and the propiconazole or Zoli there, different modes of actions. Okay, so at least you're doing that well. And where are you located at as far as, are you in a county in Florida? We'll wait for an answer, but anyway, we do have extension offices and all of that, and bringing the tissue in. Okay, so San Antonio, you do have extension there. I worked for the Texas A&M system for 4.5 years when I was there, in Bryan College Station. So find your closest extension office and bring in some samples. It's always easier to have live samples, and then if nothing else, they can certainly send off tissue culture. And we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation.
You have one other question that you missed. Is going after fungus all or nothing? I'm pretty sure powdery mildew has moved into my vegetable garden, but do I need to kill all microorganisms to get it?
Good question, Stephanie. We try to only kill the things that we need to kill at the time. There are some fungal organisms that you want in your soil. Mycorrhizal and things like that have symbiotic relationships. So those can be good. We tend, when we ever go to chemical, because a lot of these things, first thing we try to do is do some removal by even pruning. And you have to be out monitoring your garden. If you're, watering, or your garden's getting watered every afternoon by the rains and you don't go out there and all of a sudden a couple of your plants are completely inundated, then that's too late. You have to inspect your plants all the time. What I would say, the first signs of any of those types of discoloration, I would really get to the root of the problem. Horticulture joke, roots, plants, stems, leaves. But, eventually get to the root of the problem and pull it out and dispose of it is certainly a cheaper alternative than mixing chemicals. We always want people to be safely applying chemicals. And I would dare say most people don't wear enough protective equipment when they're doing that, and or look at environmental impacts and things like that.
And would you say that it's a little bit of a challenge as well, because the way the spores spread, they can't control what's in their neighbor's yard?
No, you can't. And I say good afternoon rain can splash everything, from the bottom. It can go down and keep going. So just be diligent, and then crop rotation, try to find things that aren't impacted by powdery mildew is bad. I know when I garden, I move all around the country. This is my 10th state, I think my 25th location within those 10 states. And, I try to grow what I did in the last place. And when I keep failing, I stop growing those things and buy them at the store.
And then I don't know how many slides you have. So we're at 2:53, and I think we booked up till 4, and we want to allow for more questions.
All right.
Thanks, Dr. Pat.
All right, so frac. Okay, so here we go. Keep an eye on chat for me. Good questions. I like questions from the audience because you're tuning in to learn something today, and we want to answer your questions. All right, signs. The physical evidence. Fungal mycelia. Sometimes if I'm picking up, and let's say I'm getting mushrooms in my bark mulch, and I start digging up my mulch and I see all this white stuff in there. Those are my mycelium. That is the vegetative structure of the fungal organism. That is a sign. I can hold it in my hand, I can see it. Any of the things like Sclerosia, rust spores, conchs, and mushrooms. We'll show you a slide of Sclerosia here, which is kind of a grouping of spores that are building up. Rust usually in that kind of orange to reddish range. Conchs or mushrooms, kind of platy mushrooms that grow on things like palms and mushrooms. Bacteria, we tend to get oozes, which are the breakdown of tissue. And that means if I have a stem and I have a large sunken spot, as they decompose that tissue, it can run out of there. We can also do what we call bacteria streaming. We'll show you a photo of that. And then just some leaf spots. We have no signs of the virus because the virus doesn't live on the outside of the plant. And all these things that are generally that we're seeing are on the outside of the plant now. All right, so here we go. We have powdery mildew. And here we have this kind of talc, and all this mycelia is on the outside. And it's at this point on this squash and even the Gerber daisy, it's time to probably just start taking that out. We can't prune it at that point because we don't have just a little bit. And thank you, Wilma, for putting that other one in there. Just a side note for folks who use chemicals, if you have found frac, they also make a same site, but for herbicides. So if you will search for rack, putting it in chat. And then they also have one for insecticides, which is very important. The IRAC site. Very important that you keep changing out your chemicals if that's your mode of trying to solve some issues. Here's our Sclerosia, our Sclerosis Stem Rot. And here you can see this is a sign. We can actually take that with our fingers and we can peel that off. Not that you would want to. This is usually going to occur at the base of your plant, close to the soil level. In our geranium here, we have rust spots. On the top, you're seeing the discoloration. And here's a much better example of the fungal. You'll notice that you've got a dead middle. And as these mycelia and everything on the inside spread out and consume, they are doing damage. So you have discoloration. And then you see what we talk about, what we call these circling or halos around that. If I turn that leaf over, I can actually take a tissue and just rub that, and the spores will come off, and I'll actually have orange spores on my tissue. Bacterial streaming. For the bacterial wilts of tomato, if I cut off a stem and I go inside where I can actually kind of see. And I have to have, first of all, I should be able to smell this because the bacterial infections as they decompose eventually run out of oxygen. So I kind of have anaerobic conditions where I get that stink. And this is what we call streaming because it's been decomposed on the inside will start to flow out. Some of the other ways we know we can kind of get these soaked leaf spots. This, will look kind of similar to freeze damage, but freeze damage would be much more widespread and you would see it on the top. It just means that the bacteria have decomposed all that tissue in there. And here we might have a stomate where the pressure builds up and it just starts leaking out. If you start seeing some of those things, now you have problems. Now, not everything that's clear and looks like this is a bacterial spot. We can also have insect eggs and stuff like that that can be similar color. We've already said that there's a bad smell with that. Have you ever done a compost pile and as you turn it, it stinks? Well, the reason is because now you have anaerobic bacteria in there, and as they decompose things, that's the stink. Bacteria are the main factor for decomposition in your compost, but we have good bacteria as well. If you hear bells, we have a system. So like when I'm the only one here today in the office, I know when people are coming into the building. Wilma, I don't want anybody to steal me, so I have to know in advance. All right.
So Dr. Pat, I don't know if we have an answer for this one. Is there a homemade spray recipe for treating powdery mildew?
Hang on just a second. Chris?
Yes, sir.
Come on in. Hold on just a second.
Okay.
Apologize to bother you, sir. Is it okay if I move the Prius to?
We don't generally recommend homemade sprays because they're not scientifically researched through the university. Those are mostly hearsay sprays. You might find people that recommend them, but we don't recommend them.
I think it's kind of like Dr. Pat was saying earlier,
Yeah.
when you're talking about the bleach as far as like the quantity and that type of thing, and what happens to one plant.
If they're
versus-
mixing it right and if they're using the same correct ingredients and everything.
Just to kind of build on that, you can hear me now, Wilma, right? I'm back.
Yes.
One of the things that's been really catching on as a home remedy is using vinegars as an herbicide. And some of these herbicides are getting very high acetic acid levels in there, up to the point where if you read some of these commercially available vinegars, if you know your chemical, there's always a signal word on the label. Caution is the lowest toxicity up to danger. And vinegars are in the danger range. And people will go out and spray vinegars without putting any mask on or anything like that. As it volatilizes, and it comes up, it's pouring here. We're getting rain, woohoo, rainy season. User, can't find frac. What kind of device are you using? iPhone or an Android? But yes, we try not to do the home remedies. And here again, in order for a home remedy to work, it has to go inside and kill the bacteria. When you start looking at that, if I have a leaf that already has bacteria on the inside, the damage is already done. So the best thing I could do is just remove that with a apparatus that's sanitized. All right, Wilma, try to help the person who can't find frac, and I'll keep moving. All right. Symptoms. We've got bells going on all the different entrances. We've got other class next to me today. All right, so symptoms. We've talked about that a little bit. We said the leaf spots are the smallest ones. We always want to kind of sit there and tell you once again, in kind of doing that be careful. Just because you see things. If you've ever grown poinsettias, which we see in the photo here, and you see how this is kind of following my cursor, how it's kind of all across. I've seen people where we've planted the rooted cuttings and they put the pots side by side and they pinch this under in between the pots, that it will cause damage in a line like this. So just really be careful. Some of the leaf spots like this, as you start looking at it, because we have other spots around versus a line here. So there's a couple different things. And remember, just because it's this doesn't mean you run out and start buying, chemicals to start treating. Because at this point in time, poinsettias are an aesthetic thing. And even if you cured the thing that was causing the spots, people don't want to buy something that has all the different spots on the leaf. Leaf blights. This kind of starts off as leaf spots at times, and then they start to join hands. If you look at this palm, you can see we have different leaf spots everywhere. And then when they start joining together, because the tissue is dying faster and faster, then that's what we're calling leaf blights. And it's kind of a sticky situation between what it is. And like I say, you can have the same thing. It's just more just kind of terminology. Going back to the first thing I said, Wilma, I don't know if you remember this, but when I started back in April 2017, I think probably like the first week, somebody brought in a palm leaf and it had all these orange spots all over it. And I just kind of looked dumbfounded because, well, I'm not the brightest person. And, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we've got bacterial leaf spot or something like that. And when I finally started turning around, I think Bob was probably there, or even yourself came out and said, oh, we just have a nutrient deficiency. And here we've got all these spots. They're kind of translucent orange to yellow. And the whole thing when we look at that is we don't have the dead centers and we don't have the discoloration rings. You really want to look for signs like that. On the right side, especially in St. Augustine grass in Florida, we can get chinch bugs. And I will always say, when we get things like fungal diseases and stuff like that, they generally don't skip food in the middle. When you see these dead spots, fungal diseases kind of go in an outward motion in a circle to do that. Amy wrote, I have a leaf blight on my Auricas. How to cure? Any non-toxic sprays to use? Well, Amy, the first thing I would say is make sure somebody diagnoses what the leaf blight is, because we really can't recommend anything to put on there. And, non-toxic sprays, we have less toxic by definition of putting a chemical out that has an LD50, which is a lethal dose to kill 50% of the test population. So at that point, it was toxic to 50% of the test. Just be careful. I would always say that, have somebody to identify it because it could be one of these abiotic factors that just mimics looking like a blight.
So Pat, that leads me to a question. I hear people use the word blight a lot, and sometimes it seems kind of ambiguous as to, I don't know if they just mean that it, like there was a lot of dieback, or if they mean like blight, a specific type of disease. So is there a good time to use the word blight in a time where, do you know what I mean? And I don't know if that's just because I primarily talk with.
When we look at the, potato blight and things like that, and, we have all the decay on the inside of the tubers. Blight, in the sense that we just talked about, is a symptom on the leaf where we have leaf damage and it starts to spread and make larger areas. But, if I have my pool person spraying chlorine in the pool and it hits the plant and it will do damage in a larger pattern, it's just kind of hard. And not that I'm trying to, sidestep questions here, especially like Amy's, but we are taught not to make recommendations until we see. There's two things that you have to know about chemical applications. First and foremost, the label is always the law. And there's two things that have to be known before you can spray a chemical. You have to absolutely identify the causal agent, and you have to be able to identify the plant that it's on. Because I can spray, to get rid of one thing on one plant and turn around to do it on another plant on another greenhouse bench and kill the plant. So we really do have to kind of see things. All right, here we have some fruit spots and fruit rots. It just means to the extent that the diseases are kind of moving through. And noticing these are symptoms now instead of signs, because all I see is the oozy stuff. I can't take out a bacterium here or here. Galls. A lot of times we talk about galls, and galls can be caused by a couple different things. We can have insect caused galls, and or here we have a rose crown gall. A gall is the plant's defense mechanism, and the easiest way I kind of talk about galls is kind of like the oyster and the pearl. The plant has an agitation and it's trying to solve that. And when we come to plant galls, a lot of times then the beetle or wasp or something like that will lay their eggs in that tissue, and that causes disruption. We can have, root knot nematode, which is kind of like a gall on the root system. So be careful, because if this is insect related and you're trying to spray, a fungicide on there, then you're not going to be successful. Cankers, which are lesions, which we talked about. Now, when we're looking at this citrus canker here on the citrus stem, you can see the dead edges here. And if you were to be able to feel this, and if you were to run your finger over this, you would feel that it is sunken. All that tissue under there is being broken down and it's sinking in. One of the easier ways, especially on the stems from fungal to bacterial, is to notice that the tissue is sinking in. Now, we talk about chemical applications, and you have to remember that bacteria are very, very small. When I see this canker sitting here, if I prune 6 inches down, what's the likelihood that that microscopic organism is 6 inches down in healthy tissue? Probably not, because first of all, they're going to be reproducing and consuming the food as it goes. When I look at this canker, even an inch to either side, I'm going to be fairly certain that there's no bacteria in that area, which means that if I came in and pruned below at a proper spot and then disposed of that tissue, it's really pouring here, Wilma. I don't know if you can hear that on the window, but if I start going around in circles like this, we've got a storm taking the building away. And at that point in time, Mindy, I think the presentation will just be over. So does that make sense? You can prune this out. Now, if this is the base of your new lemon tree or orange tree, you want to try to, you can't prune off the whole top. But if this is on a side branch, then those are some options before we get to the chemicals. Always, always prune or sanitize your pruning equipment in between. Symptoms. This kind of goes back to some of the things we talked about with the tobacco mosaic virus, but we can have bacterial infections and fungal infections. And we talk about how they get into the vascular system. Why? Because that's the path of least resistance versus going through. And as I start building up in those, I clog them. So the next time you're drinking a smoothie, put a cherry pit in there and try to suck the smoothie through your straw. It doesn't work. And that's why we have this kind of wilting foliage, because I shut down the vascular system. Diane put in, UF has a great resource. Click on fact sheets and scroll down to leaf spots and leaf bites. All right, thank you, Diane. Symptoms in viruses, and we talked about that we don't have signs in viruses, but we usually kind of get some cool looking patterns. Now, if we could grow variegated fruit like this and have very good plants like this that weren't a viral infection, this would be pretty good because we can make a lot more money. Remember, once again, once the plant has a virus, it is, going to die. I had one of my new students ask, can they eat these virus-infected squash? And my standard answer is to anybody who says, can you eat something? I say, you can eat anything. You put anything in your mouth, whether it has an adverse effect in your body and, you have stuff coming out the top or the bottom. That's a question that I can't answer. I'm not a medical doctor. If I were starving and I came across this, yes, I would probably eat it. If I had other food, would I eat it? Probably not. You have to make those. We used to think that, you know, pathogens couldn't leap between other things in humans, and we've just gone through a pandemic that we believe started in bats. So I don't know, you know, we say all these things just maybe because we haven't discovered things. Symptoms, we can kind of get some distorted growth. And here again, I want to caution, if you've ever heard of the term epinasty, E-P-I-N-A-S-T-Y, this is a abundance of unburned fuel that's not properly vented out of greenhouses. And I can tell you right now, it will cause the same type of stunting. Therefore, before you inundate your whole crop, make sure you know what it really is. Always find out from somebody more knowledgeable. And I will tell you, even when you're bringing it into the extension office, we have not seen everything. That's why we always reach out to our colleagues. That's why Wilma still gets questions from me. I don't bother Mindy because, well, she's too busy with everybody else. Wilma doesn't do anything, so she just waits for me to send her something.
I bother Wilma too.
All right, here we have some ring spots. Kind of cool in this pumpkin. Just kind of a review. So in our mycelia and our molds, our downy mildews and our powdery mildews, these are signs. My conchs for our Ganoderma on palms, a physical sign. Our sclerosia, we can pick all that out on the outside. And this is just, I don't know if you remember on the cross section, we had all that white stuff on the outside. Well, this is all the mycelia that's growing on the inside of the stem. Mushrooms, they're a sign. Here we have a bacterial infection. See how this is kind of sunken in, and we are kind of streaming down tissue. And here's that bacterial streaming when I cut it. Peggy wrote, nematodes seem to attack tomato plants. Yes, they do. And one of the things that we're finding is, especially in our sandy soils, we're going to talk a little bit more about the disease triangle coming up, and they are now breeding nematode resistant plants. So those are some of the things to start checking for as you grow. There are some nematicides, but they tend to be expensive. And somebody put along. Oh, so
Sorry, that was me.
All right. What did you put in, Mindy?
It's, I can attach a cleaner copy, hopefully. It's sharing a link to a webinar. The UF nematologist came to Sarasota County and took samples from our community gardens.
Okay.
And then made suggestion on how to tackle nematodes in our area. It's like a 2-hour-long webinar. So you don't want to push play right now, but I can put a link in the chat. Because that's
what are you saying, that I've killed their brain cells and they can't go any longer, or what? What, Mindy? What are you saying here?
If they can watch a pathogen webinar live and a nematode webinar recorded, my hat's off to them.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that clarification. Wow, she is being the good bad cop today, Wilma. If you're out there in the world, and if you don't know that I don't miss these two ladies up here immensely, then you don't know us all. But anyhow, our symptoms, anything that's a leaf spot, we can't find it out. Other things can spot rots. And once again, you have to realize that rots can be from overwatering, and we can have cultural and or environmental problems before. Blights, here again, by definition, we talked about that one earlier. We've got a lot of tissue starting to die out. We've got something more than just spots. The damage is being very large. And then we've got wilts. And here again, wilt can be anything from, oh my goodness, there's no water, to bacterial and fungal infections, or I happen to have beetle larvae and they're eating all my roots, or something like that. The plants can only do so few things, so you need to make sure you know what it is. All right, management. Now that we're kind of getting there. So we saw this before, and let's kind of go through this a little bit more. What the disease triangle really all is about is that you have to have all three of these before you can have a problem. And as long as we can take one of these out, then we can solve, or at least postpone, the problem. Infectious pathogens. We talked about the non-pathogenic versus the pathogenic. So we're really talking about those pathogenic ones that want to come in to a healthy plant, nothing else wrong, and attack it. Well, it's kind of hard what we said in fungal organisms. Now, bacteria, a little bit harder because we either have to have a vector or something like our pruning to keep it out. They can splash in water. If I've got that oozy spot where I've really got it sunken and water's hitting that, remember those bacterium are microscopic and they can splash in the water, which will keep them alive onto the surface of another plant. So one of the things that might help with that coming down to the environment, and there was a question in the garden, is I know garden space is at a premium and we try to put enough in, but plant spacing or using mulches and stuff like that. So if we have things, the water doesn't splash the sand up and it hit on things and move things. Susceptible hosts. This is one of those things that we kind of just talked about with the nematodes. Scientists are breeding plants all the time, and especially our food crops. If you remember way back in the 70s and 80s, Wilma wasn't even alive then, but when you look for tomatoes to buy at the store, you always wanted to see that there was a V for verticillium wilt or an F for fusarium wilt. And that meant they had been bred to be resistant of those, because back in the 70s and 80s, most of the tomatoes we lost were to those two pathogens. We don't put those on today because most everything is there. I know, and Mindy can kind of talk to this, one of the big trends in the community gardens is bringing back the heirloom varieties. And, you know, sometimes they have better flavors and stuff like that, but some of the reasons we don't grow those is because they were very susceptible to everything that was around at the time, and it took them out. So bringing them back now is fine, but once again, kind of make sure you're rotating. We are creatures of habit. I like, you know, Better Boy, or I like beefsteak tomato, and I'm going to grow them every year. I'm going to put them in the same spot in the garden every year, and that's where we come into problem. Everybody will tell you that, you know, one of the things is that susceptible host is to rotate crop. Try different things. Know what things are related to each other. How many of the plants that we plant in the garden each year in the Solanaceae family?
Ooh, a lot.
Well, we start off with potatoes. So if you're doing potatoes during the winter months, and then you harvest, and then you go ahead and you put in your eggplant and your tomatoes and your peppers, those are all in the same family. And we know when it comes to diseases that, you know, Mindy, has your son ever come home and coughed on you and given him his disease to you? Yes. It's called every winter because you are related. So if it was enough to get into his system, it's enough to get into your system. So we just have to be very careful with those types of things.
And I would say, even if you're in love with a certain kind of a plant, and the disease package varies, you know, I know one of our folks likes to grow, you know, maybe 3 different kinds of tomato that have different disease packages, simply because he doesn't know what's going to crop up that year. So like exactly like you're saying, diversify, rotate.
With that, we can kind of change that out a little bit. We hope that nurseries still are not, you know, selling pathogen or powdery mildew, not resistant. Conducive environment. This is something that we can handle a little bit more. I've seen people watering their gardens in the afternoon or late in the evening when it's got cool enough for them to go out, and they've got the aerator on the hose and they're spraying all the leaf tissue. This is a really good way to get pathogens in. Remember, watering the soil is what needs to be watered. So drip irrigation and things like that is much better. Right now, I've got a storm that's continuing to brew out there. I still have lightning and things going on, which is, by the way, abiotic. But all of the foliage out here now is wet. It is 3:21 in our time zone. If the clouds part and the sun comes out, most everything will be dry by the time nighttime comes. But if this happened to be at 8 o'clock at night, now all my foliage is wet for the whole night. That's something that we can do. Making sure I have good drainage. If I have potted plants and things like that. Just realizing the environment that's conducive to grow the fungal organism or the bacterial organism is what you need to transfer and get out. We mentioned earlier the gentleman with the tomato mosaic virus. That is something that needs to be bagged and taken off property. Never put those things in your compost pile whatsoever, because your compost pile really, I do pretty good, Mindy. I don't know if I've sent you my photos. I did, Wilma, but I'm keeping mine. I haven't turned my pile in 3 weeks now, and my core temperature is still at 100. When I turn it, I'm maintaining about 140 to 130 for about a week. So I've got really good compost piles going right now. And that's enough to kill a lot of the pathogens that go in. But if I have something that's disease, I don't even put it in there. I bag it and I put it in the trash can. I don't just throw it in my trash can, because every time I opened it, I would create a vacuum and I could suck spores out to the surrounding. You just have to be careful. Greenhouse growing taught me a lot of these very careful things. And Colleen, I don't know if I can really send some your way. If I could send some rain to Jacksonville, I would probably be paid a lot more than I am, but not that the university doesn't pay me well, they do. Thank you. All right, so I probably stole all my thunder on that first slide. Disruption is what we're really trying to get after in any of these things that we can do. When it really comes to pathogens, I would say look for resistant plants, especially if you're an avid gardener and you want to grow your food every year. You have to know these things. All right. I was at some of the nurseries the other day because I was trying to find some plants for my lesson yesterday. And I was at a big store that we won't name that sounds like Walmart. And as I was at Walmart, oh, I just said that, but every nursery does that. And there was the sales rack, right? Raise your hand out there, even if I can't see you, if you've ever bought a discounted plant because, oh my gosh, that's only 25 cents and it's regularly $5. Melba, you should be raising your hand. I know you've done this. Come on. Look at that. All the other screens are going black. I know you've done this. Jennifer, thank you. Jennifer, I will send you, an autographed business card or something like that. But the whole thing is, if it's simply because they stopped watering it and we've got some wilt and we know if we cut it back, it will grow, that's one thing. But when I start looking at a flat of plants like this, the rest of the plants aren't wilted. So that means that, maybe this looks like it's been overwatered. Be very, very careful. Because, thank you for being honest, because you can come home and if this pathogen is moved into the soil and now you're planting this in your garden, the Sarasota master gardeners know one of their peers, Dennis, and Dennis does not buy plants to put in his garden. He grows everything by seed because he's not paranoid, but he just knows that he tries to keep his soil as clean as possible. And we just don't know what's coming from the nursery. And Shirley says, done it more than once and regretted it every time. You're on here because you love plants and you want them to grow. And you hate seeing anything die because when plants die in your yard, it makes you sad. So you're trying to rescue these. Yes, it's a good thing at heart, but maybe not the best thing for pathogens. How many of you have a planting bench where you plant everything on? The whole thing with that is how many times have you sanitized that surface? Peggy says quarantine them first. That's a good practice if you can do that, if you have the space. All right. Susceptible host, buy something else. So here in the middle, we've got Kentucky Wonder beans that are rust resistant. Alter the environment. We can't always change the weather, but we can put up tents and stuff like that if we really wanted to. We can manage all these other things. Right plant, right place, which is this keystone Florida-friendly landscape principle. If we're putting Mindy may get a kick out of this one. I've now changed my terminology. I don't ever say the wrong plant anymore. I always say right plant, wrong place, because all plants have to be right. But if they're going to struggle, I tell people the secret to growing is to reduce the stress. A stress-free environment will have a healthier plant. As you go down this list, sometimes buying treated seeds if you're planting directly in the ground. And just as a caution, corn is not pink and blue if you buy it in bulk. It means there's a fungicide that's on there, and you have to make sure that
Then you just hit the same button to undo it.
All right. Just kind of skipped up there. Advising clients. So this, I know I've got some master gardeners on here today, and we've got some folks who are the clients. So this will kind of just give you some good things. Ultimately, as we've said with every one of these things, we have to identify the disease. I am perfectly fine saying that, no, I am not a good diagnoser of diseases. Why? Because, well, I do know that I can come probably to tell you it's a fungus, or I can tell you that it's a bacterial infection or a viral, but I can't tell you which bacteria it is. And I can't always tell you which fungal organism it is, especially if it doesn't. For all the folks who are in Florida who have ever seen Ganoderma conchs on a palm, do you know that not all Ganoderma infected palms produce conchs? They just die, and without knowing what it is. And I would rather not make an attempt and make somebody upset because I won't go out on a limb and say it's this bacteria versus being wrong and having you treat it with something that's not going to be successful, and then something having an accident happening with the chemicals and you being injured. So I can't do that in good faith. We do have pathology labs all across the state of Florida, and being able to send off a good sample is really one of the best things you can do. Any extension agent or master gardener volunteer, or even yourself, if you're trying to do some self-diagnosis, which you can, ask the questions. And always the first thing that we have to start looking at is what is the environment that the plant is growing in? Because we said 9 out of 10 problems start environmental or cultural. I talk to people who are watering their gardens every day and they wonder why they're having problems. And then you ask them, well, did you amend your garden? And say, yeah, I put lots of compost in there. And one of the things we know about compost is it holds water much better. So we sometimes just do our gardens in. Ask all those questions. Susceptibility is really a big thing that we've got to look at, and can we change that? The single best prevention of controlling diseases, well, to keep them out. If you suspect that a plant in your garden really has the disease, even before you think about treating it, why would you eat a diseased plant? Why would you eat fruit from a diseased plant? Remove it and start over. Your health is worth more than a tomato plant or cucumber plant or cantaloupe or anything else like that. Chemicals aren't always the cure-all. Sometimes we can build up, and if we're spraying the wrong thing, we mentioned earlier that sometimes it's hard to tell between fungal leaf spot and bacterial leaf spot. And one of the things we really tell people not to do is don't buy like 3-in-1 chemicals. I had a person the other day, Wilma, was treating the plant with a 3-in-1, which was a fungicide, bactericide, or no, it was an insecticide, fungicide, and miticide. And if they had a bacterial infection, it would have done nothing, but killed lots of good insects and other things like that. And then ultimately, some diseases don't have any controls. Do you know in the state of Florida that we have lots of things coming in, and therefore we can have brand new diseases that we haven't seen before that we don't have cures for because we really don't know what they are? Just be careful. Chemical applications is one of my soapbox issues, that I want you to be safe versus trying to eat something out of the garden. Read the label. I will tell you, before you go buy a chemical, depending on what it is, you should have downloaded IRAC, HRAC, or FRAC, and don't buy chemicals. What you should know at this point in time is that you need to rotate. getting off topic a little bit with insects, but do you know that insects can become resistant to a chemical in as little as 3 generations? And if you've ever had whitefly on your tomatoes, you know, within about a month and a half, you've had about 4, 5 different, generations. Be careful even when it comes to this. And what this label of the law is means that, once again, it has to be listed on the label before you can spray it. You have to know what it is that you're treating, and then you have to do things like apply it correctly. For their master gardeners, remember, it's better to make no diagnosis than the wrong one. When in doubt, advise them to submit a disease diagnostic sample. All right, how do you send off a sample? First of all, some of you may or may not know, but we have regional offices. Here in the Panhandle, we have the North Florida Research Extension Center, and that's in Quincy, which is just about 20 miles from here. What you want to try to do, and if you go on, if you are in Florida, if you Google search University of Florida, UF Plant Diagnostics Clinics, they will come up with a whole list of them. And you want to find the closest one to you, and you always want to make sure you kind of overnight everything. We have some very good plant pathologists, and I got to talk with Dr. Phil Harmon last week. He joined us for one of our educational instances, and then they are very straightforward in saying that if you send them dead tissue, they will send you back a note saying that the plant is dead. They have to have live tissue that's dying to be able to isolate and culture out the disease in order to do these types of things. With that, take a large representation. First of all, it's always helpful, and you need to know what the plant is, but Wilma and Mindy will tell you sometimes we'll get one leaf in, and we don't even know if it's a compound leaf that's part of something bigger, and we can't identify it. So letting them know you don't know everything that's in your yard, but certainly if it's your vegetable garden, you should know what you're growing. So that means give them something like that to keep them kind of there. Wrap them in newspaper. We try not to place things in plastic bags. Why? Way back when I used to do this more in California, people would send us stuff through the mail. And I have to age myself here, Mindy. I was alive at a time when we didn't have overnight FedEx and stuff like that. That people put their plant samples, I know, put their plant samples in the mail, and sometimes it'd take a week to get there. Well, they would put things in a baggie, and by the time they sent it to us, the fungal spores had erupted and they decomposed everything to the point that all we had was black mush inside the bag. We couldn't tell what the plant was or anything else like that. So wrapping in paper will keep the moisture from building up. They show here doing packing peanuts to keep it from getting all bruised up. One of the things that I would write on the outside for the plant diagnostic lab is that you've got, live plant sample inside. Tell the people if you expect it, something that's going to cause great injury and stuff like that, not everybody will kind of pick it up. Marie asks, where's the closest diagnostics clinic? Yeah, Gulf Coast is what, only about an hour away, Wilma, versus Gainesville?
Yeah.
And everybody thinks you've got to send everything to the Harmons in Gainesville, but you don't. We have really good folks here in Quincy. And then the faster you get it there, now there is going to be a cost to this. And let me kind of get the chat out of my way. Make sure you're downloading the newest forms, because sometimes these PowerPoints have older forms. This one is showing a $40 fee and tells you who to make the check out to everything like that. With the cost of everything that's been going on, agents used to get some free sampling, and now we're paying some minor fees because of all the different things they have to use to culture out these diseases. And with the pandemic, monies became a little tighter and things like that.
So to clarify, Pat, if a resident has questions and it's something that the local office can't identify, it's the resident's responsibility to mail and complete the form and everything like that at that point?
Yes.
Okay. So mhm.
The folks in the office can certainly help you. Wilma, you've sent off samples before and filled out the forms. The big thing is just making sure, you know, I mean, it shows you here plant type, where it's at, because they're going to just receive this without being able to ask you any questions. Make sure you fill out the forms as much as possible. You know, if you can throw a couple pictures of the overall plant in there, print them out. Do put the photos in, you know, plastic bags so they can look at that. Photos worth 1,000 words. And a lot of times, you know, if you've got the clinics and you can contact them online first, sometimes they'll even say, well, go ahead and send us a photo through email. And sometimes they'll be able to tell you what that is, even without getting the sample. Not always. They want to make positive, especially if you're a commercial grower that has the ability to lose a lot. But anybody can do this. Make sure the money's in there. And they really are pretty good because they know time is of the essence. If you overnight it, don't put it in regular mail, overnight it, and hope for the best. All right. I was kind of shooting for the hour and a half, not knowing how many questions we would get. And these are all the people that are much brighter than I am that put together the slideshow. So we'll kind of give them credit for all of that. And I don't think we have a question slide. We had another question. Here's a good question for rotating plants. Can you regrow plants in the same soil if you are growing in buckets, or do you need to replace the soil every year? And does this apply to our raised beds? All right, so a couple different things. If you are rotating plants, and I talked to our CERT group yesterday, which is the kids, which is Community Emergency Response Team. And one of the things I encourage them to do is at least one of the schools to get a 100 bucket garden for next year, Mindy. Wouldn't that be cool? And I said, use the cat litter because everybody's got those cat litter, you know, bins that recycling won't take anymore. And so with that, yeah, I would keep a history of what you're growing in them. Now, you've all heard of sun solarization and things like that. You can do some sanitizing with things like that. And I will tell you sometimes the best thing to do, not everybody has this, but if I've got just one pot full of soil, I can sanitize my driveway with bleach and I can just spread out that in a really thin layer for the day and kind of just bake things. You know, put some plastic on top of the asphalt. The asphalt will do that. And you know, some of that solarization is better. We do know that when we use sun solarization that we kind of can kill beneficial things, especially in thin layers. But, you know, that would be one of my suggestions. If you have a plant that you know is, you know, really bad, then yes, I would replace the soil and make sure sanitizing the buckets and all those things like that.
And I did put in the chat a link for the edible gardening series, since some of the questions are leaning into the edible. So folks can find that. There's like 25 videos and follow-up documentation. So if you're leaning into the edibles, there's lots of additional information in there about whether you're growing it in a container, nematodes, aphids, that type of thing.
Okay, thank you. That's why you're the host. You're all knowledgeable.
I'm good at asking people like you to come and speak. And sometimes I remember to record it.
Yeah. All right. Amy's got a question. Amy, yes, your sago palm can have mealy bugs, but it also might just have scale. There is a cycad.
Yeah,
is
that the really
scale.
bad one? That could be like the really bad scale that's hard to kill. And
It basically looks like you flock the underneath side. Mealy bugs will kind of get a little bit more fuzzy and thick on its coating, where the sago or the cycad scale will be kind of flat. You can try blasting with a strong hose. Sometimes you can do leaf damage, And in the case of, scale, they have youngs and sometimes, on the outer side of the strong.
So there's a question about what do we recommend for mixing our own soil mix for growing food in Florida. Not sure if you want to answer that, Pat, or if Molly wants to chime in. I can also put in a link to the Grow to Learn guide. I did put in the edible gardening link, which I'll put into that. And also our former ag agent had like a 2-hour-long talk all about soil. And I can put in the Grow to Learn guide that has a mix in there. But do you have any thoughts you want to share, Pat?
Sometimes that I always say, what's available locally? We have mushroom compost here, and you can buy it. Everybody's got it. They bring it in, you get a truckload of it. We have a whole bay out there that, as I used, 2 buckets every other month, it'll take me 40 years to get through all the mushroom compost, because we used to have a lot of mushroom growers north of Tallahassee and stuff like that. There are certain places that will have a lot of decomposed rice hulls and stuff like that. A lot of your municipalities have really good compost.
We use ours. Yeah,
and,
and I don't know if they're still doing it, but they've been putting compost, or what they call fines, outside of Knight's Trail. And residents, you have to be a resident. I think you can take a cubic yard at a time if they're still putting it out there. And the community gardens use it. They're still usually going to add a little of their own amendment, whether it's, whatever their preference is. But it's a nice way of adding bulk.
I think one of the big advantages to buying the municipal or getting the municipality is because they're doing it in such bulk, their piles are really getting hot, and they are cooking those things down pretty quickly, and they are reaching 160 degrees and stuff like that.
It's been steaming when it's delivered, usually to the garden.
So.
Yeah. And we had it tested by the nematologists, and at least of what they sampled, it was good results. So that's promising too.
Amy's got a question. What's the best sanitizer for pruners? Amy, if I'm in the field and I'm doing this, I will use an isopropyl alcohol. I can just spray that straight, and I can put it in a spray bottle. I don't tend to like to spray bleach, just because, well, that gets on me. I inhale it and all those things like that. And having I only do a bleach dip, but then that's something that can spill. And it's just harder. It's easier just to have a little spray bottle and do it that way. All these things will, kind of be hard on your pruners. What I would say, if you're going to do that, buy good pruners. They will have better metal. And as soon as you're done, rinse them and wash them, and then re-lubricate them. Never, dip your stuff or spray it with isopropyl alcohol and go store it for 3 months. Thank you all. It was a joy. Thank you for joining us today.